Now, you and I were born to modify cars, but it seems more like we're just forced to maintain them. So let's explore that on our '63 Buick Riviera that's got a leaking pinion seal. Behind me is our 1963 LS swapped Riviera. And unfortunately, over the last 3 years, yeah, I've been ignoring it for a little too, doesn't matter. It's got a rear pinion leak. Now, I say I've been ignoring it, I have actually swapped the seal already on this, but we ran into a few different hiccups. One being that it was still leaking after I did it, and the other being it was leaking from new and interesting spots after I replaced the pinion seal. So before we dive too deep into the problems that I've effectively created for myself, well, let's do a little bit of a history lesson on the 9 3/8 axle that Buick uses, and just differentials in general. Now, in the late 1950s, early 1960s, Buick was preparing to release the Riviera as a luxury, high-performance vehicle, and they sought a rear axle that could handle the powerful, for the time, Buick nailhead engine's torque. Buick developed the 9 3/8 axle with a removable carrier. Compared to other axles at the time, I'd actually consider it pretty overbuilt, and as long as you keep them up on their fluid, they're pretty indestructible. You better hope that they never destruct, because you're going to run into issues sourcing those parts we talked about. Now, for the Riviera, you had a gear ratio options between like 292 and 373. Most of them towards the lower end of that spectrum. And for the first 2 years, you had an option for limited slip, but it seems to be standard equipment for 1965. This axle was also used in other full-size Buick models like the Electra or Wildcat, and some Oldsmobile 88 models of the era. Now, if you're thinking this bolt-in center carrier design looks familiar, well, that's barely because it is, but not made popular by the brands I've already listed. Ford in 1957 released the 9-inch rear end with the bolt-in center carrier, and that's what you and I probably historically think of when we think big, robust axles, at least back in that time period. But let's ask the slutty differential question for 400, Alex, the daily double of differential axle questions. Why did they build it with a removable center carrier instead of just the rear cover that pops out like on normal axles? Well, a couple different reasons. At the time, they considered it ease of maintenance, which, as someone who's pulled the axle differential assembly on these things, that is not easier because it weighs like 100 pounds and it wants to crush you. Cool if you're into that thing. I'm generally... But reason number two, it's strength, and I can actually get behind this reason. Now, the whole front modular assembly is one giant hunk of cast iron. Now, let's take a look at the differential in our '63 Riviera and see what's going on with this leak. Oh yeah, she's a wet one. So clearly we have a leak coming from the pinion. Or do we? We also have a leak coming from the threads that bolt our coupler onto the pinion shaft itself. This is actually where two caps and a U-joint go to hold the drive shaft connected to your differential. I've removed it so you can see the leak a little bit better in here, but be very clear that there's two distinct leaking spots here. Now, not all pinion flanges have a little skirt like this to prevent dust and debris from whipping up in here. Thankfully, because this one's super annoying because I can't see exactly where it's leaking. But be careful about just throwing pinion seals at these things willy-nilly, especially you or someone you know has been in here before, like me, slipping into your pinion shafts at night. Upon closer inspection on our pinion flange, well, there definitely seems to be a groove here, and it's just not as tight as fit as Daddy Matt likes. So we're gonna have to address that with either a speedy sleeve or foreshadowing, they don't make a speedy sleeve that fits. Why this is important, especially with modern fluids of today? Heck, it wasn't even until the 1950s that the American Petroleum Institute introduced the GL rating for gear lubricants. So before that, they were just throwing whale oil in things and seeing how it rode. But if you're gonna start throwing in modern multi-weight, multi-viscosity fluids into these old things, sometimes they like to weep. Now, if you're interested in those specs, well, here they are. This works really well for me anytime I'm fighting a pinion that's just not working out and it's also not in the greatest shape. Luckily, our machinist is used to this, so what they do is they basically carve off a little of the flange, press a new tube onto it, and then carve it down to just slightly over what the original spec was, similar to what a speedy sleeve is. Now, the next thing we gotta talk about fixing is the leak that appears to be coming from the threads and nut that holds our pinion together. Well, this is the most expensive condom I've ever bought. I'm just kidding. This is actually the O-ring that GM specs for the Buick Riviera. Unfortunately, no one lets this information out of what size it is, and they're basically unobtainium. This one is new old stock from a dealership in the 80s, and if you're anything like me, shoving in rubber seals into a 1960s differential that came from the 80s, well, that's a recipe for bad days. I already did this once and twice. Now we're doing it No, we're not doing this again. Now, the outside of the original 80s O-ring is 39 millimeters. It's been around for 30 years, so I'll let it account for a little shrinkage, but that'll get you close enough to the ballpark. Now, the girth of this O-ring, well, it matters. It's 5.35 millimeters, or more commonly, 0.2 of an inch. So now that we got the dimensions, we can go online and find a suitable suitor. And here's the two O-rings that I was able to track down from the logically named The O-Ring Store LLC. And I'm also going to list the part number right here. Okay, wow, that's a pretty big part number if you don't. Okay, whoa, that's also pretty. All right, you don't have to do it if you don't. You should do it if you don't have. Just do whatever you think feels right on both of these accounts. Because Daddy Matt hates it when people keep specs of things to themselves and doesn't share it with the lovable people that is yourself. Now, my last and final trick is why I was complaining earlier about that weird little skirt that goes around our pinion flange. Sometimes your leak isn't actually from the seal where it meets the shaft. It's where the seal's metal ring meets the housing. Now, this kind of leak, it's really hard to diagnose because if you see something dripping from there, you assume it's actually coming from the rotating shaft and not from the area around it. So just to rule out all possibilities of somebody with a screwdriver and a hammer pounding in between and damaging the housing itself when they were replacing the seal previously, it's probably me. We need to go ahead and put a thin layer of RTV around the outside. Now, is using RTV around a seal that press fits a hack? Yeah, but I gotta get a different hobby. I do not want to be replacing pinion seals in this damn thing for a third time. So when you're up against odds, may the odds be in your favor with odds by making odd repairs. So just slather some RTV around there. Now, the last thing we're gonna talk about today is your ring and pinion preload, which is a critical measurement to how tight everything is on your actual pinion flange nut. As you can clearly see here, I didn't take anything out. That's risky. The way I got around this was by using a chisel, scribing a line on the nut, the flange, and the shaft. So then when I came back and tightened everything down, I made sure that my number of rotations was hit, as well as I lined the mark up to, in theory, get the preload exactly where it should be. Because on this axle, there is actually no crush sleeve. So it doesn't have to be replaced every time you need to do this to crush it to a certain thickness to get tension, yada, yada, yada. Don't worry about on this one. But if you don't put that nut exactly back where it was, you will destroy an axle in short order, and you'll know it because of the way that it is. And the sounds that it makes, probably on deceleration, because if you get it too loose, well, it'll grind to hell as you're decelerating, or if you get it too tight, it'll usually grind to hell as you're accelerating. I've got a 50-50 track record with this working. So, be very careful if you try to freeball it the method that I'm describing here. And would you just look at it? This is 3 weeks later, and it is not leaking a drip, except from the fill hole. Because why the fuck wouldn't it be leaking from the fill hole? That makes sense. And don't worry, 2 to 5 more times replacing that pinion seal, you'll get it. Or not. Maybe not. Sometimes we don't get it. That's okay too. Have a good one.